Hi there, thanks for joining me. In this video, I'll explain the difference between the different types of watercolor found in Corel Painter. I'm using Corel Painter X3, and if you're a user of Painter X3 or Painter 12, you might notice that there are 3 different types of watercolor layers, and when you work with them you get some different results. In fact, it can be quite confusing because all 3 of these things are called watercolor, but they're not really the same type of brush and they don't really work the same way. And if you try to combine them, you might get some unexpected results. So I'm going to help you figure out what's what here. So we have 3 examples. These are 3 different types of brushes that you can pick from. The first, sample A, is a digital watercolor. Now this is a little confusing because this is a digital painting, so all 3 of these examples are digital watercolor, but they're not referred to as digital watercolor with this exact phrase here. So if we look in our brush selector here, we can see there's this digital watercolor. This is what it's called. This is the whole category. All of these brushes are considered digital watercolor. There's also real watercolor, which is also digital watercolor, but it's called real watercolor. So you can see how this is getting confusing here. And then we have watercolor, which is yet another set of brushes that's also digital watercolor, but it's just called watercolor. So you have these 3 different categories here. Now, the difference between them, starting at the top with digital watercolor, is that digital watercolor does not create a watercolor layer. And a watercolor layer is a special kind of layer. So I'm painting with this watercolor brush right now, this digital watercolor brush, found here in this particular category. And this was one of the earlier types of watercolor found in Painter. Wasn't very advanced, but it kind of did the trick. But it works on just a regular layer. It doesn't actually do any kind of bleeding or any kind of water effects. If we take a look at the next type of watercolor, which is just a regular watercolor layer, we'll give that a try. So we'll select a watercolor brush. Let's try this runny wet bristle, and we'll try a teal color here, and we'll paint with it. And you see you get these kind of lines here, and then it starts to do this cascading vertical kind of running thing. And this was quite advanced at the time, but now it's kind of more of a novelty. I wouldn't totally disregard this as being a good brush to work with, but the more advanced watercolor brushes give some more realistic effects. So it's kind of bleeding and blending and doing its thing, and you can see that the icon for this layer is different. This is a watercolor layer, so anytime you use a watercolor brush, one of the watercolor brushes other than the digital watercolor, if you use the Watercolor Real Watercolor brushes, you get this special layer. And what this special layer is it's kind of, you could think of it like it's wet, like it's got water on it, and so while it's in this wet mode, you can keep doing things to it with watercolor brushes to blend the water together, and it'll keep calculating and keep blending the water together and doing all that nice stuff. Now, if you try to use a different kind of brush on a watercolor layer, let's say any of these other brushes like this chalk brush, you're going to get this error message. And this is where working with watercolor brushes gets really frustrating for a lot of people, because they'll paint with some watercolor, any one of these 3 types, and they'll find that occasionally now and then they get this error message and they're confused because maybe they're trying to paint with a digital watercolor brush on a watercolor layer and it's incompatible for whatever reason. So you have to kind of watch out for these different things, especially these watercolor layers. Now you can dry these layers, but when you dry them, they're no longer interactive with future watercolor brush strokes. So that gets a little tricky. Let's take a look at the third example here, example C, and that's the real watercolor. And this is the most advanced watercolor available in Painter 12.2 and in the new X3. And this is the watercolor that I recommend using. The other 2 watercolors, these are just old technology. I don't know why they're still in this program. Don't use them. Use real watercolor because it's actually doing a good job of representing a real watercolor medium. And let's put down some real watercolor strokes. So I'm in the category of real watercolor now. which again, this is still digital, it's not actually real, but that's what they call it. Let's do some strokes here and let's see what this does. Now you can see it did create a watercolor layer as the watercolor brush did, but it's doing a little bit more here. It's taking a little bit more time to let this water bleed a little more naturally, and if we try a different brush here we might get a better example of that. You can see it kind of spreads out there and really fills into the gaps of the paper in a more natural way. If I change my paper to something a little more natural, it might look a little bit better there. Let's try that. So you can see compared to the two, this example here of this old watercolor type, it's just kind of faking watercolor. You know, it looks okay from a distance, but when you look close, it's not really convincing. This real watercolor here, this actually looks pretty good. It looks a lot like, and it acts a lot like how watercolor would on real paper in real life. So you have these three options. It's up to you. If you're used to using A and B here, these first two types, keep using them. You know, I don't want to change your method or anything, but I think that this real watercolor does the best job, and it just will be less confusing if you just disregard the other two types. Now the really important thing again is you have to watch out for these layers. When you paint with a watercolor brush on a watercolor layer, that's fine, but if you make a new layer and you start painting, what's going to happen is you're going to create a new watercolor layer. Now that's different from the first layer that I made here. If I create another layer, just a regular layer, and I start painting again, yet another watercolor layer is created. So if there's regular layers in between your watercolor layers, that can be an issue. You have to really pay attention to which layer you're painting on. So when you're working with watercolors, you probably want to work with few layers, and you probably want to work just with watercolor brushes. That seems to be really the easiest thing to do all around, is just only use real watercolor brushes. If you want to use erasers, that's fine, because the erasers aren't an issue. And if you want to do some stuff to it after the fact, you know, maybe put a signature over it or something, you could do that on a new layer. That's fine. You know, I could go here and I could put my initials on this layer, but if I want to go back and do something to this watercolor again, I need to make sure that I click back on this layer. If I don't, I'm going to create a new watercolor layer, and that's probably not what I want to do, because those two watercolor blobs aren't going to interact with each other as they should. So let's do that. I'm back on this layer. I'm going to put some red in here, and let's see what that does. It kind of blends together with the red that's already there. Now, if you want to dry a watercolor layer, as I mentioned earlier, you will remove the wet liquid editability of it, but you'll still be able to do things like blend it now and smudge it around. So the way that you do that is you want to right-click on the layer, and you want to go to Convert to Default Layer. Now you can see the icon changed there. It's no longer blue, so you could think of this watercolor paint as being dry. So now that it's dry, if you go to add wet paint to it again, it's not going to work the same way. So now that it's dry, we could do something like use this diffuse blur blender, and we can blend this watercolor as if it's not even really watercolor at all. We can treat it more like it's oil paint. Or we could take it and we could use the Distort Tool to smudge it. Now this is something you can do, but probably something you're not really going to want to do unless you're doing abstract art. In most cases, if you're working with watercolor layers, you're probably trying to make something that looks like a watercolor painting, and in that case, most of the time you're going to want to stick to just watercolor layers. So I hope that answered some of your questions about how all the different types of watercolor layers work in Corel Painter. If you have any questions, feel free to comment on this video, and if you found this information useful, take a quick second to like this video and share it, and that'll make it easier for other artists out there to find this information. Thanks for watching, and stay tuned for my next video.